Strong tides crash against primordial shores. Beneath dark waters, shadows move with lethal grace. For over 160 million years, while dinosaurs thundered across the continents, a parallel world existed beneath the waves, a realm ruled by creatures equally magnificent, equally terrifying, and yet fundamentally different from their terrestrial cousins. Welcome to the forgotten empire of the ancient oceans, where reptiles evolved into forms so alien, so perfectly adapted to their watery domain, that they represent one of evolution's most spectacular transformations. Please let us know in the comments where you are watching this history video and what time you are watching it, and be sure to subscribe to the channel for future videos. When we think of the age of reptiles, our minds conjure images of Tyrannosaurus rex stalking prey through fern-filled forests, of long-necked sauropods reaching toward canopy leaves, of armored ankylosaurs and crested hadrosaurs. The dinosaurs have captured human imagination like few other creatures from Earth's deep past. Museums worldwide showcase their towering skeletons. Children memorize their names with enthusiasm usually reserved for superheroes. Popular culture has transformed them into icons of prehistoric life, yet this familiar narrative tells only half the story, the terrestrial half. Beneath the surface of ancient seas, entirely separate dynasties rose and fell. These were not dinosaurs that learned to swim. They were not simply land animals dabbling at the water's edge. Instead, they represented distinct evolutionary lineages that embraced the ocean completely, transforming over millions of years into creatures as specialized for marine life as whales are today. Their bodies became streamlined missiles cutting through prehistoric currents. Their limbs evolved into powerful flippers and paddles. Their senses adapted to detect prey in the crushing darkness of the deep. They became, in every meaningful sense, masters of their aquatic domain. The question that haunts paleontologists and evolutionary biologists is deceptively simple. Why didn't dinosaurs conquer the oceans? With their remarkable diversity on land, their adaptation to nearly every terrestrial environment from pole to pole, from desert to rainforest, why did they remain fundamentally creatures of the earth? The answer to this question reveals profound truths about evolution, adaptation, and the invisible boundaries that separate one ecological realm from another. To understand this mystery, we must first grasp what made dinosaurs dinosaurs. The defining characteristics of this group, the structure of their hips, the way their legs positioned directly beneath their bodies, their terrestrial metabolism and respiratory systems, all evolved in response to the challenges of life on land. These adaptations made them supremely successful in their terrestrial niches but simultaneously created constraints. Evolution is not infinitely flexible. Body plan that allows a creature to run swiftly across open plains does not easily transform into one suited for deep-sea diving. The respiratory system perfected for breathing air does not readily convert to extracting oxygen from water, but evolution abhors a vacuum. If dinosaurs could not exploit the vast resources of the oceans, other creatures certainly would, and they did spectacularly. Marine reptiles evolved not once but multiple times from different ancestral lineages. Each group found its own path into the seas, developed its own solutions to aquatic challenges, and carved out its own ecological roles in underwater food webs. The result was a diversity of forms that rivaled anything seen on land: sleek hunters with torpedo bodies, long-necked ambush predators, massive-jawed bone crushers, and swift pursuit specialists. These creatures lived in a world we can barely imagine. The geography of Earth during the Mesozoic era looked nothing like our modern configuration of continents and ocean basins. Vast shallow seas covered areas that are now dry land. The western interior seaway, for instance, split the North American continent in half, creating a warm, shallow marine highway stretching from the Arctic to the Gulf of Mexico. Similar seaways covered parts of Europe, Asia, and other continents. These inland seas teemed with life, creating ecological opportunities that marine reptiles eagerly exploited. The oceans themselves were different. Sea levels rose and fell dramatically over millions of years, driven by changes in the volume of mid-ocean ridges, the formation and melting of polar ice, and the arrangement of continents. Water temperatures were generally warmer than today, with tropical conditions extending much closer to the poles. Ocean chemistry differed significantly, with varying levels of oxygen, carbon dioxide, and other dissolved gases affecting which organisms could thrive where. The marine food webs built upon this foundation were both similar to and distinctly different from those we see in modern oceans. At the base of these food webs, as in oceans today, were microscopic organisms, phytoplankton, tiny photosynthetic creatures that converted sunlight into biological energy. These microscopic plants were consumed by zooplankton, small animals ranging from single-celled organisms to the larvae of larger creatures. Small fish and invertebrates fed on the zooplankton. Larger fish hunted the smaller ones, and at the top of this pyramid sat the apex predators, the marine reptiles that would become the focus of our story. But before we dive deep into the lives of these remarkable creatures, we must understand the timeline. The age of marine reptiles spans roughly 250 million years ago to 66 million years ago, covering most of the Mesozoic era. This immense stretch of time saw the rise and fall of multiple distinct groups, each dominating for its own epoch before giving way to successors. The story of marine reptiles is not a single narrative, but rather a series of chapters, each featuring different protagonists. The earliest marine reptiles appeared in the Permian and Triassic periods, as life recovered from the devastating Permian-Triassic extinction event that had wiped out over 90% of marine species. These early pioneers were relatively simple creatures, still closely resembling their land-dwelling ancestors, but they established the template, showing that reptiles could indeed return to the seas from which their distant ancestors had emerged hundreds of millions of years earlier. Among these early experimenters were creatures like Ichthyosaurs, semi-aquatic predators that likely lived much like modern seals, hunting in the water but returning to land to rest and breed. Their bodies showed intermediate adaptations, webbed feet rather than true flippers, elongated necks for snapping at fish, but still fundamentally built for a dual existence between land and sea. These creatures were not yet fully committed to marine life, but they pointed the way forward. Then came the Ichthyosaurs, whose very name means fish lizards. These creatures represent perhaps the most complete transformation from land-dwelling reptile to fully aquatic predator in the entire fossil record. The earliest Ichthyosaurs appeared in the early Triassic, shortly after the Permian extinction, and they wasted no time in diversifying into numerous forms. By the Middle Triassic, some Ichthyosaurs had grown to enormous sizes, rivaling modern sperm whales in length. What made Ichthyosaurs so remarkable was their convergent evolution with fish and millions of years later, with marine mammals like dolphins. Despite having evolved from land-dwelling reptiles, Ichthyosaurs developed a body plan nearly identical to that of sharks and tuna, a streamlined, torpedo-shaped body with a tall dorsal fin, a powerful tail with vertical flukes, and flipper-like limbs. This similarity is not coincidence, but rather the result of similar environmental pressures producing similar solutions. In the physics of moving through water, certain body shapes simply work better than others, and natural selection drives unrelated lineages toward these optimal forms. The skull of an ichthyosaur tells the story of a supreme aquatic predator. Long, narrow jaws bristled with sharp, conical teeth perfect for gripping slippery prey. But perhaps most striking were the eyes, enormous, sometimes exceeding 30 centimeters in diameter, among the largest eyes of any vertebrate that has ever lived. These massive eyes were surrounded by a ring of bony plates called sclerotic rings, which helped the eyeball maintain its shape under the intense pressure of deep dives. The size of these eyes reveals crucial information about ichthyosaur behavior. Such enormous eyes were not needed for hunting in shallow, sunlit waters. Instead, they suggest that ichthyosaurs dived deep, pursuing prey into the dim, twilight waters of the mesopelagic zone, where even the faintest glimmer of light must be captured and amplified. Fossil evidence supports this interpretation in dramatic fashion. Some ichthyosaur specimens show evidence of decompression sickness, the same condition that afflicts human divers who surface too quickly, causing dissolved gases in the blood to form damaging bubbles. The presence of this condition in fossilized bones proves that these animals regularly dived to significant depths, experiencing pressures that would crush most air-breathing creatures, then return to the surface rapidly enough to occasionally suffer the consequences. But perhaps the most remarkable evidence of ichthyosaur adaptation to marine life comes from extraordinary fossils that preserve not just bones but soft tissues, and even, in rare cases, evidence of live birth. Unlike their land-dwelling reptilian cousins that laid eggs, ichthyosaurs gave birth to live young, just as whales and dolphins do today. Fossils have been found showing female ichthyosaurs frozen in the act of giving birth, with partially emerged babies still connected to their mothers. Other specimens show baby ichthyosaurs that were apparently stillborn or died shortly after birth, swallowed whole by their mothers in a behavior that seems shocking to us, but was likely an instinctive response to prevent the scent of death from attracting predators. These fossils also reveal that baby ichthyosaurs were born tail first, another adaptation shared with modern marine mammals. Being born tail first prevents the newborn from drowning during the birth process, If the head emerged first, the baby might attempt to breathe while still partially inside the mother, inhaling water and drowning. The tail first birth position ensures that the infant's head is the last part to emerge, allowing it to take its first breath only when fully born and able to swim immediately to the surface. The diversity of ichthyosaurs was staggering. Some species grew no larger than a human, swift pursuit predators that hunted small fish and squid in open waters. Others reached lengths of over 20 meters, massive beasts that likely fed on large prey or perhaps even employed filter feeding strategies similar to modern baleen whales. Their geographic distribution was equally impressive, with ichthyosaur fossils recovered from every continent including Antarctica, indicating that these reptiles had spread throughout the world's oceans, adapting to tropical, temperate, and even polar marine environments. The reign of ichthyosaurs lasted for over 150 million years, an almost incomprehensible span of time during which they evolved, diversified, and adapted to changing ocean conditions. Yet they did not rule alone. As ichthyosaurs dominated the open ocean, other marine reptile groups established themselves in different ecological niches, creating a complex tapestry of predators, prey, and competitors. Among the most distinctive of these other groups were the Plesiosaurs, creatures so unusual in appearance that when the first fossils were discovered in the early 19th century, some scientists suspected them of being fakes. Plesiosaurs possessed a body plan unlike anything seen before or since: a broad, barrel-shaped body, 4 large, diamond-shaped flippers, and in most species, an extraordinarily long neck that could comprise more than half the animal's total length. The first Plesiosaurs appeared in the late Triassic or early Jurassic, slightly after the initial radiation of ichthyosaurs. Unlike ichthyosaurs, which evolved into forms closely resembling fish, Plesiosaurs maintained a body plan that was distinctly reptilian, yet modified in unique ways for aquatic life. Their 4 flippers, evolved from the legs of terrestrial ancestors, moved in a coordinated rowing motion sometimes described as underwater flying. This method of propulsion was fundamentally different from the tail-powered swimming of ichthyosaurs, sharks, and most fish. Biomechanical studies using computer models and robot replicas have revealed how Plesiosaurs swam. Rather than simply rowing like a boat, they employed a complex flight-like motion, the front flippers providing most of the forward thrust while the rear flippers helped with steering and stability. The flippers moved through the water in figure-8 patterns, creating vortices that provided both lift and propulsion. This swimming style was likely more maneuverable than the high-speed pursuit swimming of ichthyosaurs, suggesting that Plesiosaurs filled different ecological roles. The long necks of many Plesiosaurs have puzzled scientists since their discovery. Some species had necks containing 70 or more vertebrae, creating a flexible appendage that could comprise 6 meters or more of length. What was the purpose of such an extreme adaptation? Various theories have been proposed over the years. Early researchers imagined Plesiosaurs raising their necks high above the water surface like swans, but this seems unlikely given the mechanical difficulties of supporting such a heavy structure in air and the lack of any obvious benefit to doing so. More plausible interpretations suggest that the long neck was a fishing tool. A plesiosaur could position its bulky body at a distance from a school of fish, then strike with its long neck, the small head at the end moving with considerable speed despite the neck's length. The neck provided reach, allowing the animal to capture prey without the prey detecting the large body behind it. Some researchers have suggested that plesiosaurs fed in shallow waters or near the sea floor, using their necks to probe into crevices and narrow spaces where their bodies could not fit. However, the long neck also imposed limitations. The neck vertebrae, while numerous, were not strongly interlocked, giving the neck flexibility but reducing its strength. Biomechanical analyses suggest that plesiosaur necks could not have generated powerful lateral strikes or withstood significant struggling from large prey. Instead, they likely fed on smaller, more manageable prey items, fish, squid, and other marine creatures that could be grabbed and swallowed with minimal resistance. The diversity within the plesiosaur group was considerable. Some species remained relatively small, no larger than a modern dolphin. Others grew to impressive sizes, reaching lengths of 15 meters or more. Different species showed varying neck proportions, from the extremely long-necked forms like Elasmosaurus to those with more moderate proportions. This diversity suggests that plesiosaurs adapted to a wide range of ecological niches and feeding strategies over their long evolutionary history. But not all plesiosaurs followed the long-necked body plan. A related group, the Pliosaurs, evolved in a dramatically different direction. Where most plesiosaurs had long necks and relatively small heads, Pliosaurs developed short, thick necks and enormous, heavily muscled skulls armed with massive teeth. These were not subtle hunters relying on stealth and reach. Pliosaurs were the marine equivalent of Tyrannosaurus rex, apex predators built for power, capable of taking down the largest prey in their environment. The size of some pliosaurs was truly monstrous. Species like Chronosaurus and Plesiosaurus reached lengths of 10 to 12 meters or more, with skulls measuring 2 to 3 meters long. These skulls were not delicate fishing tools, but rather massive bone-crushing instruments. The teeth, some as long as a human hand, were thick and robust, designed to pierce flesh and shatter bone. The jaw muscles that powered these fearsome weapons have been estimated, based on skull structure and muscle attachment sites, to have generated bite forces comparable to or exceeding those of Tyrannosaurus rex. What did such massive predators eat? Fossil evidence provides direct answers. Pliosaur stomach contents have been found containing the remains of other marine reptiles, large fish, and even other pliosaurs, suggesting cannibalism was not uncommon. Bite marks on Ichthyosaur and Plesiosaur fossils match the tooth patterns of pliosaurs, confirming that even other large marine reptiles were on the menu. Some fossil specimens show evidence of scavenging, with pliosaur teeth marks on carcasses that were likely already dead when the pliosaur found them, indicating these predators were opportunistic, willing to take advantage of any food source. The hunting strategies of pliosaurs likely differed significantly from those of their long-necked plesiosaur relatives. Rather than using stealth and reach, pliosaurs probably relied on power and speed. Their compact, streamlined bodies, more similar in proportion to ichthyosaurs than to other plesiosaurs, would have allowed for bursts of rapid acceleration. Their massive flippers, powered by enormous muscles anchored to their barrel-shaped bodies, could generate tremendous thrust. A hunting pliosaur would have been a terrifying sight, a multi-ton missile of muscle and teeth, accelerating from ambush or pursuit to strike with devastating force. The relationship between plesiosaurs and pliosaurs illustrates an important principle in evolutionary biology: adaptive radiation. Starting from a common ancestor, these groups diverged to fill different ecological roles. Long-necked plesiosaurs became specialized for hunting smaller, more agile prey in ways that emphasized reach and precision. Pliosaurs, by contrast, became increasingly specialized for hunting larger, more robust prey, developing the power and weaponry necessary to overcome substantial resistance. Both groups were successful, each in its own way, and together they dominated marine ecosystems for over 100 million years. Yet even as ichthyosaurs, plesiosaurs, and pliosaurs ruled the Mesozoic seas, new competitors were evolving. In the Late Cretaceous period, roughly 100 million years ago, a new group of marine reptiles emerged from an unlikely source: land-dwelling monitor lizards. These creatures, the Mosasaurs, would become the last great dynasty of marine reptiles and in many ways the most successful. The evolutionary story of Mosasaurs is particularly well documented in the fossil record, providing a rare window into how land animals transition to marine life. The earliest Mosasaur ancestors were semi-aquatic lizards, creatures that lived along coastlines and hunted in shallow waters but still spent considerable time on land. Fossils from this early stage show animals that looked much like modern monitor lizards, but with slightly modified tails and limbs that hint at increasing adaptation to swimming. Over several million years, these early forms evolved into progressively more aquatic species. The limbs transformed into flippers, though never losing their five-fingered structure. Mosasaur flippers retained individual digits connected by webbing or enclosed in a paddle-like structure, unlike the more highly modified flippers of ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs. The tail developed a deep, laterally flattened shape with a tail fluke, creating a powerful swimming organ. The body became more elongated and streamlined, the skull structure modified to better handle the stresses of aquatic hunting. By the middle of the Late Cretaceous period, Mosasaurs had become fully marine and had diversified into a stunning array of forms. Some species remained relatively small and generalized, likely filling similar ecological roles to modern sharks. Others became enormous, rivaling the largest pliosaurs. The largest mosasaurs, such as Mosasaurus hoffmanni, reached lengths of 17 meters or more, making them among the largest marine predators of their time. Mosasaur skulls reveal sophisticated predatory adaptations. The teeth came in various forms depending on the species. Some had sharp, recurved teeth for gripping fish, others had blunt, crushing teeth for dealing with shelled prey, and still others had massive fangs for dispatching large prey. Many mosasaurs possessed a unique feature called pterygoid teeth, additional teeth located on bones in the roof of the mouth. These extra teeth help prevent prey from escaping once captured, essentially creating a tooth-lined tunnel that would draw prey deeper into the throat with each swallowing motion. Even more remarkable was the jaw structure. Like snakes, their closest living relatives, mosasaurs had flexible joints in their lower jaws that allowed the two halves to move somewhat independently and spread apart, enabling them to swallow prey larger than their head would normally accommodate. Some mosasaurs took this even further, developing a flexible joint in the middle of the lower jaw that allowed it to bow outward, further increasing gape size. These adaptations made mosasaurs incredibly efficient predators, capable of consuming prey of substantial size. The diversity of mosasaur species and their adaptations to different ecological niches was impressive. Tylosaurus, a large mosasaur from the western interior seaway, had an elongated snout that may have been used as a ram or club to stun prey. Globidans had rounded, button-like teeth perfect for crushing the shells of mollusks and sea turtles. Pliosaurus was extremely streamlined, suggesting a lifestyle of high-speed pursuit in open waters. Halosaurus was smaller and more lightly built, possibly specializing in hunting smaller fish and squid in coastal environments. Fossil evidence of mosasaur behavior is particularly rich. We have fossils showing healed injuries from combat with prey or rivals. We have stomach contents revealing what individual mosasaurs ate for their last meals. We have trackways, yes, trackways from shallow water environments where mosasaurs apparently pulled themselves along the bottom using their flippers, possibly during mating or while hunting in very shallow areas. We even have evidence of live birth, similar to ichthyosaurs, confirming that mosasaurs were fully committed to marine life and did not return to land to lay eggs. The geographic spread of mosasaurs was global. Fossils have been found on every continent, including Antarctica, and from environments ranging from shallow coastal waters to deep ocean basins. This worldwide distribution, combined with their diverse adaptations, made mosasaurs the dominant marine predators of the Late Cretaceous period. In many ecosystems, they had largely replaced the previously dominant groups, with ichthyosaurs already in decline or extinct and plesiosaurs reduced to fewer species and more restricted ranges. What caused this turnover in marine reptile dominance? Why did ichthyosaurs, after more than 150 million years of success, decline and disappear before the end of the Mesozoic? Why did plesiosaurs, similarly successful for over 100 million years, yield their ecological roles to the relative newcomers, the mosasaurs? These questions touch on fundamental issues in evolutionary biology and ecology, the dynamics of competition, the effects of environmental change, and the role of chance in shaping the history of life. Environmental change certainly played a role. The Late Cretaceous period witnessed significant fluctuations in sea level, ocean temperature, and ocean chemistry. These changes affected the entire marine food web from the bottom up. Changes in plankton communities would have cascaded upward, affecting fish populations, which in turn affected the predators that fed on them. Groups that were specialized for particular conditions might have struggled as those conditions changed, while more adaptable or generalist groups might have thrived. Competition with other groups may also have been a factor. As mosasaurs diversified and grew more numerous, they would have competed with ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs for food and space. If mosasaurs had advantages in efficiency, reproductive rate, or other factors, they might have gradually displaced the older groups. However, competition alone rarely drives groups to complete extinction. Usually, competing groups partition resources, specializing in different prey, different depths, or different geographic areas. The near-total disappearance of ichthyosaurs before the end Cretaceous extinction event suggests that factors beyond simple competition were at work. Disease, random events, and simple bad luck may have also played roles. A severe disease outbreak could devastate a group already stressed by environmental changes. A series of unlucky events, several breeding seasons with unusually high juvenile mortality, for instance, could push a declining population past the point of recovery. In small populations, genetic diversity decreases, potentially reducing the population's ability to adapt to new challenges. Once a downward spiral begins, it can be difficult or impossible to reverse. Understanding these extinction dynamics is not merely an academic exercise. The patterns we see in the fossil record of marine reptiles inform our understanding of how modern ecosystems might respond to contemporary environmental changes. The lesson from the Mesozoic seas is that even groups that have been successful for millions of years are not immune to extinction. Dominance is temporary. Adaptation is necessary but not sufficient. And the interconnectedness of ecosystems means that changes at one level can cascade unpredictably to affect even the most powerful apex predators. To truly understand the world of marine reptiles, we must also understand the environments they inhabited. The oceans of the Mesozoic era were not merely wetter versions of Mesozoic land. They were fundamentally different realms with their own rules, their own challenges, and their own opportunities. Water is a very different medium from air. It is approximately 800 times denser, which dramatically affects how organisms move, how they sense their environment, and how they maintain their body temperature. This density provides support. Aquatic animals can achieve sizes impossible on land because water's buoyancy counteracts gravity's pull. The largest dinosaurs, impressive as they were limited by the structural constraints of supporting their weight on land. But in water, those constraints disappear, allowing marine reptiles and other sea creatures to reach truly gigantic sizes. However, water's density also creates resistance. Moving through water requires more energy than moving through air. This is why streamlining is so critical for aquatic animals. The most successful marine predators, whether ancient reptiles or modern sharks and whales, converge on similar body shapes, torpedo-like forms that minimize drag and maximize efficiency. Every protrusion, every irregular surface, creates turbulence and slows the animal down. The sleek, smooth bodies of Ichthyosaurs and Mosasaurs reflect millions of years of selection pressure, favoring hydrodynamic efficiency. Temperature regulation in water also differs dramatically from temperature regulation in air. Water conducts heat away from a body much more rapidly than air does. A naked human can survive for hours in air at temperatures just above freezing, but will succumb to hypothermia in less than an hour in water of the same temperature. Marine reptiles face the same challenge. Unlike fish, which are generally cold-blooded and whose body temperature matches the surrounding water, reptiles evolved from terrestrial ancestors that likely had some degree of metabolic heat generation. Evidence suggests that many marine reptiles, particularly Ichthyosaurs and possibly some Mosasaurs, were partially warm-blooded, maintaining body temperatures higher than the surrounding water. This would have provided significant advantages: faster muscle contraction, quicker reflexes, better digestion, and the ability to hunt in colder waters where cold-blooded prey would be sluggish. However, it also required substantial energy input. A warm-blooded marine reptile would have needed to eat much more than a cold-blooded one of the same size, driving it to be an efficient and active hunter. Some Ichthyosaur fossils preserve evidence of blubber, thick layers of fat beneath the skin, similar to what we see in modern whales and seals. This blubber served multiple purposes. It provided insulation, helping maintain body temperature in cold water. It served as an energy reserve, allowing the animal to survive periods when food was scarce. And it contributed to buoyancy control, helping the animal maintain its position in the water column without constantly swimming. The senses of marine reptiles had to adapt to the aquatic environment. Vision, so important for land animals, operates differently underwater. Water absorbs light, filtering out red wavelengths first, then progressively shorter wavelengths as depth increases. Below about 200 meters, even in the clearest ocean water, there is insufficient light for conventional vision to function. The enormous eyes of Ichthyosaurs were adaptations to this challenge, capturing as much of the available light as possible and allowing these animals to hunt in deep, dim waters where prey might be abundant but visibility was poor. But vision was not the only sense that mattered. Sound travels much better in water than in air, about 4 times faster and over much greater distances. Many marine animals, including modern whales and dolphins, rely heavily on sound for navigation, communication, and hunting. Did marine reptiles use sound in similar ways? The fossil evidence is ambiguous. We can examine the structure of ear bones and brain cases to infer something about hearing capabilities, but soft tissues like the complex sound-producing organs of modern whales do not preserve well in fossils. Some researchers have suggested that Mosasaurs might have had reasonably good underwater hearing based on the structure of their ear bones. The large size of certain cranial nerves in Ichthyosaur skulls hints at well-developed sensory processing, though whether this related to vision, hearing, or other senses is unclear. The truth is that we may never know the full sensory world of these ancient creatures, what sounds they heard, what they might have vocalized, how they perceived their environment through senses we can only infer from bone and rock. Sense of smell, or more accurately for aquatic animals, the sense of taste-smell, as chemicals must be dissolved in water to be detected, was likely important for marine reptiles. Many modern marine predators use chemical sensing to detect prey, follow trails of scent in the current, or locate potential mates. The structure of nasal passages and the portions of the brain dedicated to olfactory processing can provide clues about how important this sense was for different marine reptile groups. Another sense that some marine reptiles might have possessed is electroreception, the ability to detect the electrical fields generated by the muscle contractions and nerve impulses of other animals. Modern sharks have this ability, using specialized organs called ampullae of Lorenzini to detect even the faint electrical signature of a fish buried in sand. Some researchers have identified pits and grooves on Mosasaur skulls that might have housed similar electroreceptive organs, though this interpretation remains controversial. If confirmed, it would suggest that Mosasaurs hunted using a sensory modality completely alien to our human experience. The world in which these senses operated was shaped by the unique geography of the Mesozoic era. The configuration of continents and ocean basins changed dramatically over the 160 million year span of the age of marine reptiles. In the Triassic period, when the first Ichthyosaurs appeared, all the continents were joined together in the supercontinent Pangaea, surrounded by a single global ocean called Panthalassa. This configuration meant that marine reptiles could potentially swim around the entire world without encountering impassable barriers. As Pangaea began to break apart during the Jurassic and Cretaceous periods, new ocean basins opened. The Atlantic Ocean formed as the Americas separated from Europe and Africa. The split of Gondwana created the Indian Ocean. These new oceans provided new habitats, new migration routes, and new opportunities for isolation and speciation. Marine reptile populations that had once been connected could become separated, evolving independently and potentially giving rise to new species. Perhaps even more significant than the opening of deep ocean basins was the flooding of continental interiors. During periods of high sea level, which occurred multiple times during the Mesozoic, shallow seas covered vast areas of the continents. These epicontinental seas, as they are called, created enormous areas of warm, shallow, productive marine habitat. The western interior seaway of North America was one such sea, stretching from the Gulf of Mexico to the Arctic Ocean at its maximum extent and splitting the continent into eastern and western landmasses. These shallow seas were marine reptile paradises. The water was warm, heated by the sun and by the subtropical climate that prevailed over much of the world during the Mesozoic. Nutrients washed in from the adjacent landmasses, fertilizing the waters and promoting abundant plankton growth. The plankton supported enormous populations of fish, squid, and other marine life, which in turn supported the predators that fed on them. Fossils from the western interior seaway include not only Mosasaurs but also Plesiosaurs, giant sea turtles, enormous fish, and sharks, painting a picture of an ecosystem teeming with life. The shallow depth of these seas had important implications. Unlike the open ocean, where the water column can extend thousands of meters down into crushing darkness, the epicontinental seas were rarely more than a few hundred meters deep. This meant that the entire water column was within reach of at least some sunlight for much of the depth, allowing photosynthesis to occur more widely and supporting more productive food webs. It also meant that the bottom was accessible to predators, creating niches for species that hunted along the seafloor or in the interface between water and sediment. Seasonal variations in these environments could be dramatic. Rivers draining the adjacent continents would swell during rainy seasons, pouring fresh water and sediment into the seas, potentially creating brackish conditions along coastlines and estuaries. During dry seasons, evaporation might increase salinity in isolated bays and lagoons. Storms could churn the waters, mixing nutrients from depth and triggering plankton blooms. These environmental fluctuations would have created a constantly changing mosaic of conditions, favoring species that could adapt to variability. The food webs supported by these environments were complex and multi-layered. At the base were the photosynthetic organisms, primarily single-celled phytoplankton like diatoms, dinoflagellates, and coccolithophores. These microscopic plants converted sunlight and dissolved nutrients into living tissue, forming the foundation upon which everything else depended. Their productivity was ultimately limited by the availability of nutrients, particularly nitrogen and phosphorus, which came from river runoff, upwelling of deep water, and the recycling of organic matter from dead organisms. Phytoplankton were consumed by zooplankton, tiny animals including the larvae of larger creatures, small crustaceans, and single-celled protozoans. These in turn were eaten by small fish, which were eaten by larger fish, and so on up the food chain. At each level, energy was lost, consumed for metabolism, movement, growth, and reproduction. This inefficiency meant that it took vast quantities of phytoplankton to support a much smaller mass of zooplankton, a smaller mass still of small fish, and an even smaller mass of large predators. The pyramid of biomass was steep, with each level supporting only about 10% of the mass of the level below. This energy flow dynamic had crucial implications for marine reptiles as apex predators. A single large Mosasaur or Pliosaur required an enormous supporting food web. Calculations based on modern ecosystems suggest that supporting 1 ton of apex predator biomass might require 10 tons of large prey fish, which would require 100 tons of small fish, which would require 1,000 tons of zooplankton, which would require 10,000 tons of phytoplankton. A thriving population of large marine predators therefore required truly vast areas of productive ocean. The fragility of this system becomes apparent when we consider what happens if the base is disrupted. If something affects the phytoplankton, a change in ocean chemistry, a temperature shift, reduced nutrient input, the effects cascade upward. Zooplankton populations crash without sufficient food. Small fish, lacking zooplankton, starve or fail to reproduce. Larger fish, depleted of their prey, decline. And at the top of the pyramid, the apex predators find themselves in a collapsing ecosystem with insufficient food to sustain their populations. This vulnerability was not merely theoretical. Multiple times during the Mesozoic era, ocean conditions changed rapidly, triggering disruptions to marine food webs. Ocean anoxic events, periods when much of the ocean became depleted of oxygen, occurred several times during the Jurassic and Cretaceous periods. These events were catastrophic for marine life, particularly for oxygen-breathing creatures like fish and marine reptiles. The causes of ocean anoxic events are complex, involving factors like volcanic activity, changes in ocean circulation, and the burial of organic matter, but their effects were unmistakable: widespread death and ecosystem collapse. Even without extreme events like ocean anoxia, natural variations in ocean productivity could stress marine reptile populations. El Niño-like oscillations, where changes in ocean temperature and circulation patterns temporarily reduced upwelling and productivity in certain regions, might have created periodic food shortages. Marine reptiles, with their high metabolic demands and need for abundant prey, would have been particularly vulnerable to such fluctuations. Yet for over 150 million years, marine reptile lineages persisted through these challenges. The key to their success was likely diversity, not just species diversity, but diversity of adaptations, of feeding strategies, of habitat preferences. When conditions changed in one region or affected one type of prey, species with different adaptations or that fed on different resources could survive. The surviving populations could then expand and diversify again, repopulating ecosystems and restoring the previous patterns of diversity. This pattern of decline and recovery, of local extinctions followed by repopulation, played out countless times over the millions of years of marine reptile evolution. Each cycle pruned away some species and favored others. Each environmental challenge acted as a filter, selecting for particular traits and eliminating others. Over deep time, this process shaped the evolution of marine reptile groups, driving the spectacular adaptations we see in the fossil record. Understanding these dynamics requires us to think about deep time in ways that are fundamentally challenging to human intuition. Our personal experience encompasses at most a century. Human civilization extends back perhaps 10,000 years, but the marine reptiles thrived for timescales 15,000 times longer than all of human history. Landscapes that seem permanent to us, mountain ranges, river valleys, coastlines, are temporary features at these timescales, rising and eroding, flooding and draining in cycles that would be imperceptible in a human lifetime, but that profoundly shaped the environments marine reptiles inhabited. The fossilization process itself represents another temporal puzzle. The vast majority of organisms that die are not fossilized. Scavengers consume their tissues. Bacteria decompose what remains. Bones are scattered by currents or crushed by geological processes. For a fossil to form and persist until human paleontologists discover it, millions of years later, requires an extraordinary chain of unlikely events. First, the organism must die in an environment where rapid burial is possible, usually in sediments at the bottom of a body of water. Rapid burial protects the remains from scavengers and allows the fossilization process to begin. Minerals dissolved in groundwater gradually infiltrate the bones, replacing the original calcium phosphate with more stable minerals like calcite or silica. If conditions are right, even soft tissues can leave impressions or rarely be replaced by minerals, creating extraordinary fossils that preserve skin, muscles, or internal organs. But fossilization is only the first step. The fossil must then survive millions of years of geological processes. The sediments containing the fossil may be buried under thousands of meters of additional sediment, compressing and heating them, potentially destroying delicate structures. Tectonic forces may fold, fracture, or metamorphose the rock, again potentially destroying fossils. Even if the fossil survives these processes, it must eventually be exposed at the surface through erosion, and exposed at a time when humans are present to discover it, before erosion destroys the fossil entirely. Given this gauntlet of unlikely events, it is remarkable that we have any marine reptile fossils at all. Yet we have thousands of specimens from hundreds of species, recovered from every continent. This abundance is a testament to the true abundance of these creatures in Mesozoic seas. For every individual that became fossilized and discovered, millions more lived and died without leaving any trace. The fossils we have represent the merest fraction of the populations that existed, a fragmentary sample that nevertheless allows us to reconstruct the broad patterns of their evolution and ecology. Some fossil localities are particularly rich, preserving not just isolated bones but complete skeletons, sometimes multiple skeletons, occasionally with soft tissues or stomach contents. These exceptional preservation sites, called Lagerstätten, provide extraordinary windows into the ancient past. The Halsmatten quarries of Germany have yielded hundreds of exquisitely preserved Ichthyosaur fossils, many complete with skin outlines and, as mentioned earlier, even pregnant females with developing embryos. The Smoky Hill Chalk of Kansas, deposited in the western interior seaway, has produced numerous Mosasaur and Plesiosaur specimens, often beautifully complete and occasionally preserving stomach contents that reveal what these animals ate. These exceptional fossils allow paleontologists to ask and answer questions that would be impossible with fragmentary material. What did the animal look like in life? How did its proportions compare to related species? What did it eat? Did it fall victim to predators, and if so, which ones? Did it suffer from diseases or injuries, and did it recover from them? Each exceptional fossil is like a snapshot, a frozen moment from millions of years ago that provides detailed information about not just the fossilized animal, but about the entire ecosystem in which it lived. Modern technology has dramatically enhanced our ability to extract information from fossils. CT scanning allows paleontologists to see inside fossilized skulls, revealing the shape of the brain cavity and the paths of nerves and blood vessels. Chemical analysis can detect preserved organic compounds, providing information about diet, metabolism, and even, in some cases, coloration. Microscopic examination reveals cellular structures and growth patterns in bones, allowing researchers to estimate ages, growth rates, and metabolic rates. Biomechanical modeling, using computers to simulate how muscles and bones work together, allows researchers to test hypotheses about how extinct animals moved and fed. By creating digital models of fossil bones and applying our understanding of muscle anatomy and biomechanics, scientists can estimate how fast an ichthyosaur could swim, how powerful a pliosaur's bite was, or how maneuverable a plesiosaur was in pursuit of prey. These models can be tested against modern animals with known capabilities, refining our methods and increasing confidence in the results. The picture that emerges from all these lines of evidence is of marine reptiles as sophisticated, highly adapted predators fully capable of exploiting the resources of Mesozoic oceans. They were not primitive or inferior versions of modern marine mammals. They were, in their own right, supreme evolutionary achievements, products of millions of years of selection and adaptation that made them as well suited to their environments as any animal that has ever lived. Yet they are gone. Not a single lineage of truly marine reptiles survived beyond the end of the Cretaceous period, 66 million years ago. The seas that once teemed with Ichthyosaurs, Plesiosaurs, and Mosasaurs were left to other groups, to sharks, to bony fish, and eventually to the marine mammals that would evolve from land-dwelling ancestors tens of millions of years after the last marine reptile disappeared. What happened to end their reign? The answer involves one of the most catastrophic events in Earth's history, but also involves more subtle processes and vulnerabilities that had been building for millions of years. To understand the extinction of the marine reptiles, we must examine both the immediate trigger and the underlying conditions that made them vulnerable. But before we reach that end, we must complete our survey of the world they inhabited and the remarkable adaptations they evolved. The respiratory systems of marine reptiles presented unique challenges and solutions. Unlike fish, which extract oxygen from water using gills, marine reptiles evolved from air-breathing land ancestors and retained lungs throughout their aquatic evolution. This meant they had to surface regularly to breathe, a constraint that fish did not face and that required specific adaptations. The frequency with which marine reptiles needed to breathe depended on several factors: their metabolic rate, their activity level, and the efficiency of their oxygen storage and use. Modern diving mammals like whales and seals provide useful comparisons. These animals have evolved numerous adaptations for efficient diving. Their muscles contain high concentrations of myoglobin, a protein that stores oxygen, allowing them to continue muscular activity even when holding their breath for extended periods. Their blood has elevated concentrations of hemoglobin and a higher overall blood volume, increasing oxygen carrying capacity. They can tolerate higher levels of carbon dioxide in their blood than terrestrial mammals, allowing them to hold their breath longer before the urge to breathe becomes overwhelming. Evidence suggests that marine reptiles possessed similar adaptations. Bone structure in some ichthyosaurs hints at elevated myoglobin levels. The large size of the chest cavity in many marine reptiles suggests substantial lung capacity. The presence of decompression sickness indicators in some fossils, as mentioned earlier, confirms that at least some species regularly dived to depth and held their breath for durations sufficient to create physiological stress. The diving behavior of different marine reptile groups likely varied considerably. Ichthyosaurs, with their deep diving adaptations and evidence of feeding on deep water prey like squid, probably regularly dived to hundreds of meters and remained submerged for extended periods, perhaps 30 minutes or more, comparable to modern sperm whales. Mosasaurs, with their generally shallower habitat preferences and prey selection, might have made shorter, shallower dives, perhaps remaining submerged for only 5 to 10 minutes before surfacing to breathe. Plesiosaurs present an interesting puzzle. Their body structure suggests they were not particularly fast or efficient swimmers compared to ichthyosaurs or mosasaurs. Their long necks, while useful for reaching prey, would have created drag and reduced swimming efficiency. These characteristics suggest that plesiosaurs might have been relatively shallow water hunters, perhaps making short dives to pursue prey or spending considerable time near the surface. However, some plesiosaur fossils have been found in deposits representing deep, open ocean conditions, suggesting that at least some species ventured into deeper waters, either following prey or migrating between feeding areas. The need to surface and breathe had important implications for marine reptile behavior and ecology. Unlike fish, which can remain continuously at depth, marine reptiles were tied to the surface. This constraint would have made them more vulnerable to surface weather conditions. Storms, waves, and rough seas would have made breathing difficult and potentially dangerous. It might also have influenced their geographic distribution, with some species avoiding regions where surface conditions were frequently severe. Breathing requirements might also have influenced social behavior. Modern whales and dolphins often coordinate their breathing, surfacing together in groups. This coordination allows them to minimize the time spent at the vulnerable surface and helps maintain group cohesion during deep dives. Did marine reptiles exhibit similar coordinated behavior? The evidence is limited, but some fossil discoveries hint at the possibility. Several sites have yielded multiple individuals of the same species preserved together, suggesting that at least sometimes marine reptiles congregated in groups. Whether these represent true social groups that lived together or simply aggregations formed for specific purposes, breeding, feeding in a particularly rich area, or mass death due to some environmental catastrophe, is difficult to determine from fossils alone. However, the existence of such accumulations suggests that marine reptiles were not always solitary hunters but could and did gather in numbers. The reproductive biology of marine reptiles, while partially understood from exceptional fossils, still holds many mysteries. As mentioned, we know that ichthyosaurs and mosasaurs gave birth to live young in the water, eliminating the need to return to land. But many questions remain. How long was the gestation period? How many young did a female produce in a typical birth? How much parental care, if any, did the young receive after birth? Modern marine mammals show a range of reproductive strategies. Some, like baleen whales, produce a single large offspring after a gestation period of a year or more. The calf is born relatively well developed and stays with its mother for months or even years, nursing and learning survival skills. Others, like seals, produce offspring more frequently but provide less extensive care. The pups are weaned quickly and must fend for themselves at a relatively young age. Given the diversity of marine reptile groups and their different ecological roles, it seems likely that they exhibited similar diversity in reproductive strategies. Larger species with slower metabolisms probably reproduced less frequently, but invested more in each offspring. Smaller, more active species might have reproduced more often with less investment per offspring. Species living in stable environments might have had consistent breeding patterns, while those in variable environments might have adjusted their reproduction in response to resource availability. Some researchers have speculated about possible breeding grounds for marine reptiles. Modern marine animals often migrate long distances to specific areas for breeding. Gray whales travel from Arctic feeding grounds to warm lagoons in Mexico to give birth, while sea turtles return to specific beaches to lay eggs. Did marine reptiles undertake similar migrations? Fossil evidence is limited, but the wide geographic distribution of some species and the discovery of juvenile specimens in certain areas, but not others, hints that migratory behavior might have occurred. The growth rates of marine reptiles provide another window into their biology. By examining growth lines in bones, similar to tree rings, which record periods of fast and slow growth, paleontologists can estimate how quickly individuals grew and how long they lived. These studies reveal considerable variation among species. Some ichthyosaurs appear to have grown rapidly in their early years, reaching adult size within a decade or two, then continuing to grow more slowly throughout their lives. This pattern suggests a relatively fast metabolism and high food requirements, consistent with the interpretation of ichthyosaurs as active, warm-blooded predators. Other marine reptiles showed slower growth rates, taking decades to reach full size, suggesting slower metabolisms and lower energy requirements. The maximum lifespan of marine reptiles is difficult to determine, but some individuals clearly lived for many decades. Growth lines in the largest specimens suggest ages of 40, 50, or even more years. These are long-lived animals, comparable to modern large sharks and marine mammals. Long lifespans have important ecological and evolutionary implications. They mean that populations turn over slowly, with each generation lasting decades. They mean that the accumulation of knowledge and experience, if marine reptiles were capable of learning and memory, which seems likely, could play an important role in survival. They also mean that reproduction must have been relatively infrequent, with females producing only a limited number of offspring over their lifetimes, making populations potentially vulnerable to high mortality rates. The interactions between different marine reptile species and other marine organisms created complex ecological webs. Marine reptiles were not alone in the seas. They shared their environment with sharks, which had already been diversifying for hundreds of millions of years before the first marine reptiles appeared. Some sharks grew to immense sizes, rivaling marine reptiles as apex predators. Ichthyosaurs, a giant filter-feeding fish, reached lengths of perhaps 20 meters or more, making it one of the largest animals in Mesozoic seas, though its diet of plankton meant it posed no threat to other large animals. Ammonites, shelled relatives of modern squids and octopuses, were abundant throughout much of the Mesozoic. Some species grew to enormous sizes, with shells measuring 2 meters or more in diameter. These creatures occupied various ecological niches, from small planktonic forms to large active predators. Marine reptiles certainly fed on ammonites. Some fossils preserve ammonite shells with tooth marks from marine reptile attacks, and ammonite shells have been found in the stomach contents of some specimens. Giant marine crocodiles, particularly in the Jurassic period, competed with marine reptiles for food and space. These were not the semi-aquatic riverine crocodiles we know today, but fully marine forms with flippers, compressed tails, and adaptations for life in the open ocean. Some reached lengths of 10 meters or more, making them formidable predators. The relationship between these marine crocodiles and the various marine reptile groups was likely complex, sometimes competitors, sometimes predator and prey, depending on the species and circumstances. Sea turtles, which first appeared in the Jurassic period, shared the waters with marine reptiles throughout much of the Mesozoic. Some species reached enormous sizes. Archelon from the Late Cretaceous had a shell measuring over 4 meters across, making it by far the largest turtle that has ever lived. These giant turtles likely fed on jellyfish and other soft-bodied prey, occupying a different ecological niche than the predatory marine reptiles and thus coexisting without direct competition. The diversity and abundance of all these groups indicate that Mesozoic marine ecosystems were rich and productive, supporting a complex and interconnected web of species. Energy flowed from sunlight to phytoplankton to zooplankton to fish to large predators, with numerous side branches, filter feeders consuming plankton directly, scavengers feeding on dead organisms, parasites exploiting living hosts. Each species, each individual was embedded in this web, dependent on it and contributing to it. The health of the entire system depended on the continued functioning of its parts. Remove or significantly reduce any component, and effects would ripple through the system. This interconnectedness was a source of stability. Redundancy in the system meant that if one species declined, others might fill its role, but it was also a source of vulnerability. Disruption to fundamental processes, like the photosynthetic production of phytoplankton, would affect everything that depended on it, directly or indirectly. As we will see in the next part of our exploration, this vulnerability would ultimately prove catastrophic. But for now, suspended in the middle of the Mesozoic, with tens of millions of years still ahead, marine reptiles ruled supreme. The seas belonged to them, and they had diversified into every available niche, from shallow coastal waters to the deepest ocean trenches accessible to air-breathing predators. Their success seemed assured, their dominance unassailable. They could not know that the world that sustained them was more fragile than it appeared, or that forces beyond the ocean, forces cosmic in scale, would soon reshape everything. The Cretaceous period stretched across nearly 80 million years, from approximately 145 million years ago to the cataclysmic boundary event 66 million years ago that would end the Mesozoic era. This vast span of time witnessed the final evolutionary chapters of marine reptiles, their ultimate diversification, their final dominance, and their sudden, catastrophic end. To understand what happened to these magnificent creatures, we must first understand the world at its peak, the late Cretaceous oceans at their most productive, their most diverse, and their most complex. By 90 million years ago, the configuration of continents had changed dramatically from the unified Pangaea of the Triassic. The Atlantic Ocean had widened significantly, separating the Americas from Europe and Africa by thousands of kilometers of open water. India had broken free from Gondwana and was racing northward on its eventual collision course with Asia. Australia was beginning its separation from Antarctica. The world was fragmenting, creating isolated landmasses and distinct ocean basins. Sea levels during the late Cretaceous reached heights not seen before or since in Earth's history. At the maximum extent, approximately 80 million years ago, seas covered roughly 40% of the current land area, far more than the current coverage of about 30%. This flooding created vast epicontinental seaways that cut across continents, creating thousands of kilometers of productive shallow marine habitat. The western interior seaway of North America extended from the modern Gulf of Mexico to the Arctic Ocean, reaching widths of nearly 1,000 kilometers. This seaway divided the continent into two separate landmasses, Laramidia to the west and Appalachia to the east. The seaway was not uniformly deep, rather, it was a complex mosaic of depths, currents, and environments. Some areas were deep enough to remain perpetually dark at the bottom, while others were so shallow that storms would churn sediment from the seafloor all the way to the surface. The productivity of this seaway was extraordinary. Nutrients washing from the adjacent landmasses fertilized the waters, supporting dense populations of phytoplankton. The phytoplankton supported zooplankton, which supported fish populations of stunning abundance and diversity. Fossils from the Smoky Hill chalk, deposited during the peak of the seaway's extent, include numerous species of fish, some small schooling species, others large predators measuring several meters in length, and even giant filter feeders straining plankton from the water. This abundance of fish supported corresponding populations of predators. Mosasaurs dominated the late Cretaceous seas in a way that no marine reptile group had previously achieved. Their diversity was remarkable. Dozens of genera and potentially hundreds of species occupied different ecological niches across the world's oceans. Some were small, agile hunters of fish in coastal waters. Others were massive apex predators capable of taking down any prey they encountered. Tylosaurus proriger, one of the largest mosasaurs from the western interior seaway, reached lengths of 12 to 14 meters. Its skull alone measured nearly 2 meters in length, armed with teeth designed for gripping large, struggling prey. Fossil evidence reveals that Tylosaurus fed on a diverse diet: large fish, sharks, plesiosaurs, sea turtles, diving birds, and even other mosasaurs. Some Tylosaurus fossils bear scars from combat, suggesting that these predators were not shy about attacking formidable prey or engaging in potentially violent interactions with rivals. The elongated snout of Tylosaurus, extending well forward of the teeth, has puzzled paleontologists. Unlike the tooth-studded jaws of other mosasaurs, this extension seems to serve no obvious purpose in food capture. Various hypotheses have been proposed. Some researchers suggest it functioned as a ram, used to stun prey with a powerful blow before biting. Others propose it was a sensory organ, perhaps housing electroreceptors that could detect the electrical signatures of prey. Still others suggest it might have been a sexual display feature, used by males to compete for females or establish dominance. Supporting the ramming hypothesis, some Tylosaurus fossils show damage to the snout tip consistent with high-impact collisions. Additionally, some prey specimens, particularly Plesiosaurs, show damage patterns that could have been caused by such ramming attacks. However, the evidence remains circumstantial, and the true function of this unusual structure may never be known with certainty. Other Mosasaurs specialized in different ways. Globidans, as mentioned earlier, had teeth modified into crushing buttons rather than piercing fangs. These teeth were perfect for dealing with hard-shelled prey mollusks, crustaceans, and sea turtles. Where patterns on Globidans' teeth show scratches and pits consistent with crushing hard materials, confirming this interpretation. Stomach contents in some specimens include fragments of crushed shells, providing direct evidence of diet. Platecarpus was a medium-sized mosasaur with a more generalized body plan and diet. Fossils suggest it fed primarily on fish and squid, using its relatively simple conical teeth to grip slippery prey. Its smaller size and lighter build compared to giants like Tylosaurus suggest it might have been faster and more maneuverable, compensating for its inability to overpower large prey with speed and agility. Pliosaurus from the very end of the Cretaceous showed extreme streamlining. Its body proportions resembled those of modern tuna, built for sustained high-speed swimming in open water. The tail was particularly deep and powerful, capable of generating tremendous thrust. The flippers were relatively small and positioned well forward, suggesting they were used primarily for steering rather than propulsion. This body plan indicates that Pliosaurus was a pursuit predator, chasing down fast-swimming prey in open water rather than relying on ambush or power. The geographic distribution of Mosasaur species was global, with different species dominating different regions. Some species were cosmopolitan, found in deposits on multiple continents, suggesting they were capable of crossing ocean basins and tolerating a wide range of conditions. Others were endemic to specific regions, perhaps adapted to local conditions or simply unable to disperse across barriers like deep ocean trenches or unfavorable currents. While mosasaurs dominated the late Cretaceous seas, they did not completely replace earlier groups. Plesiosaurs persisted, though in reduced diversity compared to their Jurassic heyday. The Plesiosaurs of the late Cretaceous showed interesting evolutionary trends. Many species were relatively large, suggesting they were competing primarily for larger prey items or had shifted to ecological niches not exploited by mosasaurs. Elasmosaurus, perhaps the most famous late Cretaceous plesiosaur, exemplified the extreme long-necked body plan. Its neck contained over 70 vertebrae and reached lengths of more than 6 meters, longer than the entire body and tail combined. The head at the end of this extraordinary neck was relatively small, with modest teeth suitable for catching small to medium-sized fish. The functional implications of such an extreme neck have been debated extensively. The neck vertebrae were connected by relatively weak joints that allowed flexibility, but provided limited resistance to lateral forces. This structure indicates that Elasmosaurus could not have made rapid, powerful lateral strikes with its neck. The vertebrae might have dislocated or damaged under such stresses. Instead, the neck likely moved in more subtle, controlled ways, perhaps slowly extending toward prey to minimize disturbance of the water and avoid alerting the prey to the approach of the large body behind. Some researchers have proposed that long-necked plesiosaurs fed by swimming above schools of fish and dangling their necks down into the school, snapping up individuals while the bulk of the body remained at a distance. Others suggest they might have hunted along the seafloor, using their necks to probe into crevices and irregular terrain where their bodies could not fit. The true behavior might have varied depending on circumstances, with these animals capable of multiple hunting strategies. Polycotylus, a smaller plesiosaur from the western interior seaway, showed different adaptations. Its neck was shorter and more robust than that of Elasmosaurus, and its overall body proportions suggest greater swimming speed. Remarkably, a fossil specimen of Polycotylus was discovered with a fossilized fetus preserved inside the body cavity, providing direct evidence of live birth in plesiosaurs and confirming that, like ichthyosaurs and mosasaurs, at least some plesiosaurs had fully committed to marine life without returning to land to reproduce. Pliosaurs also persisted into the late Cretaceous, though they too were less diverse than in earlier periods. These short-necked, large-headed predators continued to fill the role of apex predators in some ecosystems. Kronosaurus from the early Cretaceous of Australia was one of the largest pliosaurs, with estimates of its length ranging from 9 to over 10 meters. Its skull was enormous, measuring up to nearly 3 meters in length, and was armed with massive teeth. The bite force of large pliosaurs like Kronosaurus has been estimated using biomechanical models based on skull structure, muscle attachment points, and comparisons with modern crocodiles. These estimates suggest bite forces in the range of 15,000 to 20,000 newtons or more, comparable to or exceeding the bite force of Tyrannosaurus rex. Such tremendous biting power was necessary to overcome the struggles of large prey and to break through protective structures like the shells of sea turtles or the ribs and vertebrae of other marine reptiles. Stomach contents preserved in some pliosaur specimens reveal the direct evidence of their predatory capabilities. One specimen contained the remains of a Plesiosaur, evidence of predation or scavenging on other marine reptiles. Another contained large fish and shark remains. The diversity of prey types indicates that pliosaurs were opportunistic apex predators, taking whatever large prey was available rather than specializing in specific prey types. The relationship between different marine reptile groups in late Cretaceous ecosystems was undoubtedly complex. Mosasaurs, Plesiosaurs, and Pliosaurs all occupied predatory niches, creating potential for competition. However, differences in body size, hunting strategies, and prey preferences would have partitioned resources to some degree. Large Mosasaurs and Pliosaurs might have competed more directly for the same prey, while smaller Mosasaurs, medium-sized Plesiosaurs, and juvenile individuals of larger species would have fed on different resources. Competition alone rarely leads to the complete elimination of competing species in stable ecosystems. Instead, natural selection tends to favor divergence. Competing species evolve to exploit slightly different resources or habitats, reducing direct competition and allowing coexistence. The fact that multiple marine reptile groups coexisted throughout much of the Cretaceous suggests that such resource partitioning was occurring. However, when environmental conditions change, the balance of competition can shift. Species that were well adapted to previous conditions might suddenly find themselves at a disadvantage. Species that were previously excluded from certain resources by competitive superiority of rivals might gain opportunities if those rivals are stressed by changing conditions. The late Cretaceous witnessed significant environmental fluctuations that would have repeatedly reshuffled these competitive dynamics. Ocean temperatures varied considerably during the Cretaceous. Some periods saw very warm conditions, with sea surface temperatures in the tropics potentially exceeding 30 degrees Celsius and with warm water extending far into polar regions. During these warm periods, the temperature gradient from equator to pole was much less steep than today, potentially weakening ocean circulation patterns and creating regions of stagnant water with low oxygen levels. Other periods saw cooling, with temperatures dropping several degrees globally. While still warmer than modern oceans, these cooler periods would have affected the distribution of temperature-sensitive species and potentially altered ocean circulation, nutrient distribution, and productivity patterns. Species adapted to warm water might have retreated toward the tropics during cool periods, while more cold-tolerant species could have expanded their ranges. Ocean chemistry also fluctuated, with important implications for marine life. The Cretaceous saw several ocean anoxic events, periods when large volumes of ocean water became depleted of oxygen. These events were triggered by complex interactions between climate, ocean circulation, volcanic activity, and biological processes. During an anoxic event, oxygen-breathing organisms like fish and marine reptiles would have been forced to abandon affected areas or die. The reduction in available habitat and prey would have stressed populations, potentially leading to extinctions or population crashes. The causes of ocean anoxic events are still debated, but volcanic activity seems to have played a key role. Large igneous provinces, regions where enormous volumes of basaltic lava erupted over relatively short geological timescales, were active during several Cretaceous anoxic events. These eruptions released massive amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, triggering global warming. The warmer climate accelerated the water cycle, increasing rainfall and weathering of rocks, which washed increased nutrients into the oceans. The increased nutrients triggered plankton blooms of extraordinary magnitude. As this enormous mass of plankton died and sank, bacteria decomposing the organic matter consumed oxygen. If the rate of oxygen consumption exceeded the rate at which ocean circulation could replenish oxygen from the surface, anoxic conditions would develop. The anoxia would kill more organisms, providing even more organic matter for decomposition, creating a potential feedback loop that could expand anoxic zones throughout the ocean depths. The surface waters would remain oxygenated. They were in direct contact with the atmosphere and received oxygen from photosynthesis. But deeper waters could become completely anoxic, creating what oceanographers call a dead zone. Marine reptiles, as air-breathing surface dwellers that needed to dive to feed, would have found their viable habitat compressed into a thin surface layer. If their prey also avoided the anoxic depths, prey populations would have declined due to reduced habitat, stressing predator populations in turn. Several major ocean anoxic events occurred during the Cretaceous. The most severe, the Oceanic Anoxic Event 2, OAE2, occurred around 94 million years ago during the Cenomanian-Turonian boundary. This event lasted for several 100,000 years and affected oceans globally. Fossil evidence shows significant extinctions among marine organisms during this period, particularly among plankton species, which formed the base of marine food webs. Marine reptiles also showed changes in diversity around the time of OAE2, though the pattern is complex. Some groups, particularly among Ichthyosaurs, were already in decline before the event and may have gone extinct around this time or shortly after. Ichthyosaurs, which had been diverse and abundant for over 150 million years, seemingly disappeared from the fossil record in the mid-Cretaceous, well before the end Cretaceous mass extinction. The causes of Ichthyosaur extinction remain uncertain. They had survived previous environmental changes and mass extinction events, suggesting they were resilient and adaptable. Yet something about the mid-Cretaceous environmental conditions proved insurmountable. Several hypotheses have been proposed, each with supporting and contradictory evidence. One hypothesis suggests that changing ocean conditions, perhaps related to OAE2 or other environmental shifts, reduced populations of the specific prey species that Ichthyosaurs depended on. If Ichthyosaurs had become specialized for particular prey types and those prey populations crashed, Ichthyosaurs might have been unable to shift to alternative food sources quickly enough to avoid starvation. Another hypothesis focuses on competition with other groups, particularly Mosasaurs and advanced sharks. As these groups diversified and improved their swimming efficiency and hunting capabilities, they might have outcompeted Ichthyosaurs for food and space. However, this explanation seems less likely. Ichthyosaurs and potential competitors had coexisted for millions of years, and competitive exclusion typically leads to niche partitioning rather than complete extinction. A third hypothesis suggests that Ichthyosaurs might have been vulnerable due to their reproductive biology. If Ichthyosaurs had long gestation periods and produced few offspring, their populations might have been slow to recover from any mortality event. If environmental changes increased juvenile mortality or reduced reproductive success, populations could have entered a decline from which they could not recover. The true cause was likely some combination of these factors, possibly with additional stresses we haven't identified. The extinction of Ichthyosaurs represents one of the great mysteries of marine reptile paleontology. A group that had been supremely successful for longer than mammalian evolution has thus far lasted, vanishing without obvious cause and well before the cataclysm that would end the Cretaceous. With Ichthyosaurs gone, Mosasaurs expanded into some of the ecological niches they had vacated. The diversity of Mosasaurs increased dramatically in the later part of the Late Cretaceous, from about 85 million years ago to the end of the period. This timing suggests that the disappearance of Ichthyosaurs might have created opportunities that Mosasaurs exploited, though it's impossible to know whether Mosasaurs actively displaced Ichthyosaurs or simply filled empty niches after Ichthyosaurs disappeared. During the final 20 million years of the Cretaceous, from approximately 86 million to 66 million years ago, the marine ecosystems reached a stable configuration that seemed sustainable. Mosasaurs dominated as apex predators across most ocean environments. Plesiosaurs persisted in reduced diversity, filling specialized niches that Mosasaurs apparently did not exploit as effectively. Sharks continued their long evolutionary success, with some lineages growing to enormous sizes while others remained small and generalized. Giant sea turtles, massive predatory fish, and countless smaller organisms filled the supporting roles in the food web. The continents during this time were lush and productive. The climate was warm and equable, with much of the world experiencing tropical or subtropical conditions. Dinosaurs diversified into spectacular forms. The famous dinosaurs that capture human imagination, like Tyrannosaurus rex, Triceratops, and the hadrosaurs with their elaborate crests, all lived during this final chapter of the Cretaceous. Flowering plants had recently evolved and were beginning to transform terrestrial ecosystems. Birds had diversified from their dinosaurian ancestors and were filling numerous aerial niches. This was the peak of the Mesozoic world, a period of high diversity, high productivity, and apparent stability. Looking at the fossil record from this time, there is little indication of the catastrophe about to unfold. The ecosystem seemed healthy and robust. The species seemed well adapted and successful. The future seemed to promise continued evolution and diversification, but forces beyond Earth were about to intervene. Somewhere in the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter, gravitational perturbations nudged a rocky body out of its stable orbit. The asteroid, approximately 10 to 15 kilometers in diameter and with a mass of perhaps 1 trillion tons, began a new trajectory, one that would intersect with Earth's orbit. The asteroid had been in space for billions of years, since the formation of the solar system. It was a relic from the planetary formation process, a building block of planets that had never been incorporated into a larger world. For nearly all of Earth's history, it had posed no threat, orbiting peacefully in the asteroid belt. But now, perhaps due to a collision with another asteroid or a gravitational interaction with Jupiter, its path had changed. The journey from the asteroid belt to Earth would have taken years or possibly decades, depending on the exact orbital mechanics. During this time, life on Earth continued obliviously. Marine reptiles hunted in the seas, dinosaurs roamed the continents. The web of life continued in patterns that had persisted for millions of years. Nothing on Earth could detect the approaching doom. Nothing could prepare, nothing could escape. Approximately 66 million years ago, on a day that seemed like any other, the asteroid entered Earth's atmosphere traveling at roughly 20 kilometers per second, about 70,000 kilometers per hour. The friction with the atmosphere heated the asteroid's surface to incandescence, creating a fireball visible across thousands of kilometers. But the atmosphere, which provides a protective shield against smaller objects, was nothing but a thin veil to an object of this size and velocity. The asteroid barely slowed during its fraction of a second passage through the atmosphere. The impact occurred in a shallow sea, near what is now the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico. The location, known as Chicxulub, has been extensively studied by geologists, and the impact crater has been mapped using gravitational and magnetic surveys. The crater measures roughly 180 kilometers in diameter and is buried under hundreds of meters of younger sediment. The energy released by the impact was beyond any scale of human experience. Estimates suggest it was equivalent to approximately 100 trillion tons of TNT, roughly 1 billion times more powerful than the atomic bombs that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. To put this in perspective, if you could somehow convert the entire annual energy consumption of modern human civilization into a single explosive event, it would still be less than 1/10 of the energy released at Chicxulub. The immediate effects of the impact were devastating but localized. The asteroid vaporized instantly, creating a fireball of superheated rock and gas that expanded outward at supersonic speeds. The ocean water at the impact site was also vaporized or blasted outward, creating a temporary cavity in the ocean kilometers deep. Rock from the impact site was melted, vaporized, or shattered and ejected at enormous velocities. Some material was thrown completely out of the atmosphere into space, while other material was launched on ballistic trajectories that would rain down across the globe. The shock wave from the impact propagated outward through the Earth's crust at several kilometers per second, triggering the largest earthquake in Earth's history, estimated at magnitude 10 or 11 on the Richter scale, far beyond any earthquake in recorded human history. This earthquake was felt worldwide and triggered landslides, submarine slumps, and secondary earthquakes along fault lines thousands of kilometers away. The ocean water displaced by the impact created tsunamis of unimaginable scale. Wave heights in the Gulf of Mexico might have exceeded 100 meters, higher than a 30-story building. These waves swept across the shallow seas covering much of North America, Africa, and South America, traveling hundreds of kilometers inland in some areas. The waves scoured the seafloor and coastlines, destroying benthic communities and killing anything unable to escape the violent water movements. But as terrible as these immediate effects were, they were limited geographically. The earthquake, while global, lasted only minutes. The tsunamis, while destructive, affected primarily coastlines and shallow seas. marine life in the deep ocean far from coastlines might have survived these effects. If the impact's effects had ended here, the extinction event might have been significant but not catastrophic. However, the impact triggered a cascade of global environmental changes that would persist for years and fundamentally disrupt the biosphere. The material ejected into the atmosphere by the impact, vaporized rock, dust, soot, and aerosols, spread worldwide within hours. The amount of material was staggering, perhaps hundreds of billions of tons distributed throughout the atmosphere. This material blocked sunlight. The exact degree and duration of the blocking have been debated, but most models suggest that sunlight reaching Earth's surface was reduced by 90% or more for a period of months to years. Some scenarios suggest near-complete darkness, insufficient light for photosynthesis, lasting for 6 months to 2 years. The loss of sunlight had immediate implications for the base of the food web. Phytoplankton, the microscopic photosynthetic organisms that form the foundation of marine food webs, require sunlight to survive. Without sufficient light, they die within days to weeks. The collapse of phytoplankton populations would have been rapid and complete in regions where sunlight was blocked most thoroughly. Without phytoplankton, zooplankton populations would have crashed. Without zooplankton, small fish populations would have collapsed. The cascade would have propagated upward through the food web at a rate determined by the lifespan and energy reserves of organisms at each level. Small organisms with high metabolisms and limited energy reserves would have died first within weeks. Larger organisms with slower metabolisms and greater reserves could have survived longer, perhaps months or even years. The largest marine reptiles, with their size providing substantial energy reserves, might have survived the initial starvation period. But as months turned to years and the food web remained collapsed, even these giants would have exhausted their reserves. The darkness would have been accompanied by other environmental stresses. The impact ejected sulfur-rich rocks into the atmosphere, where they reacted with water vapor to form sulfuric acid. This acid fell as acid rain worldwide, acidifying surface ocean waters and potentially affecting organisms with calcium carbonate shells or skeletons. The disruption to the ocean's chemical balance would have added additional stress to already struggling ecosystems. The impact also ignited fires on a continental scale. The heat from the fireball, combined with the reentry of ejected material raining down across the globe, ignited vegetation across vast areas. Soot from these fires added to the atmospheric burden, contributing to the blocking of sunlight and potentially introducing toxic compounds into the atmosphere and oceans. Some researchers have suggested that the fires might have been so extensive that they consumed much of the world's forests and grasslands, fundamentally altering the terrestrial landscape. Temperature swings added to the chaos. The immediate aftermath of the impact was likely very hot due to the thermal radiation from re-entering debris. Some models suggest that the infrared radiation might have been sufficient to ignite vegetation and cause severe burns to any animals caught in the open. This pulse of heat lasted only hours but would have been globally devastating. Following the heat pulse, the blockage of sunlight created a prolonged period of cold, an impact winter analogous to the nuclear winter scenario that would result from a large-scale nuclear war. Without sunlight warming the surface, temperatures plummeted. Estimates suggest average global temperatures might have dropped by 10 to 15 degrees Celsius or more. Shallow seas and land areas at high latitudes might have frozen. The cold would have persisted as long as the sunlight remained blocked, potentially years. Eventually, the dust and aerosols settled out of the atmosphere and sunlight returned, but the environmental chaos was not over. The carbon dioxide released by the impact, by the burning of vegetation, and by chemical reactions in the shattered rocks accumulated in the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, and its buildup would have caused global warming lasting for thousands of years after the impact. The temperature swings from extreme heat immediately after impact to extreme cold during the impact winter to warming as carbon dioxide accumulated would have prevented stable climate conditions for a very long time. In the oceans, the effects cascaded through ecosystems with inexorable logic. The collapse of phytoplankton populations meant the collapse of everything that depended on them. Zooplankton lacking food died within weeks. Small fish lacking zooplankton died within months. Larger fish lacking small fish died within a year or two, and at the top of the food web, marine reptiles found themselves in a world devoid of prey. The most specialized marine reptiles would have been most vulnerable. Species that fed exclusively on particular prey types would have had no alternatives when those prey disappeared. Species with high metabolic rates requiring frequent feeding would have exhausted their reserves quickly. Large-bodied species, despite their greater reserves, required enormous quantities of food to sustain themselves and would have found the depleted oceans unable to support them. Some organisms survived by exploiting resources that persisted through the catastrophe. Scavengers could feed on the abundant dead and dying organisms in the immediate aftermath. Detritivores could consume organic matter sinking from the dying surface ecosystems. Organisms in deep-sea environments, where food webs were based not on photosynthesis but on chemical energy from hydrothermal vents, might have been largely unaffected by the surface catastrophe. But marine reptiles, as air-breathing predators dependent on food webs rooted in photosynthesis, had no such refuge. They required abundant prey to survive, and that prey had vanished. The fossil record from the boundary layer marking the impact shows a clear pattern. Marine reptile fossils are abundant in rocks deposited before the impact, absent in rocks deposited after. Not a single lineage of large marine reptiles survived the event. This extinction was not limited to marine reptiles. In the oceans, ammonites, which had thrived for hundreds of millions of years, went completely extinct. All species, all lineages vanished. Many types of plankton disappeared. Many fish groups were decimated, though some survived. On land, the non-avian dinosaurs went extinct, along with pterosaurs and many other groups. Yet the extinction was selective. Birds, which are technically dinosaurs, survived, as did mammals, crocodiles, lizards, snakes, turtles, and many other groups. In the oceans, sharks survived, as did bony fish, though with reduced diversity. This selectivity provides clues about what characteristics promoted survival. Generally, smaller organisms had better survival rates than large ones. This makes sense in the context of a food web collapse. Small organisms require less food and can survive on scarce resources that would be insufficient for giants. Organisms with flexible diets survived better than specialists. If your preferred food disappeared, the ability to switch to alternatives was crucial. Organisms capable of dormancy, hibernation, or other low-energy survival strategies had advantages during the period of scarcity. Marine reptiles possessed few of these survival-promoting characteristics. They were generally large, with high energy requirements. Their predatory lifestyle meant they required abundant prey and could not easily switch to detritus or plant material. They could not hibernate or reduce their metabolic rate to minimal levels. As air-breathing reptiles with at least partially warm-blooded metabolisms, they needed to remain active to surface and breathe. When the food webs collapsed, they had nowhere to turn and no way to wait out the crisis. The extinction was not instantaneous. The fossil record suggests that some marine reptiles survived for months or possibly even years after the impact. Juveniles and smaller species likely died first, followed by larger individuals as they exhausted their energy reserves. The very last marine reptiles might have survived in isolated refugia where local conditions permitted some food web persistence, but eventually even these remnant populations would have succumbed. In the aftermath, the oceans were greatly simplified. The complex food webs with multiple levels of predators and diverse prey species were reduced to simpler systems. The recovery would take millions of years as surviving lineages diversified to fill vacant niches and new groups evolved to exploit available resources. The recovery pattern in the oceans followed a predictable sequence. First, the base of the food web recovered. Phytoplankton populations rebounded quickly once sunlight returned. These organisms reproduce rapidly and can colonize available resources within years. Zooplankton populations recovered next, feeding on the abundant phytoplankton. Then small fish, then larger fish, rebuilding the food web from the bottom up. But the niches previously filled by marine reptiles remained empty. For millions of years after the extinction, there were no large marine predators comparable to the Mosasaurs and Plesiosaurs that had vanished. Sharks, which had survived, began to diversify and grow larger, filling some of the vacant predatory niches. Some fish groups also evolved larger body sizes and became apex predators. Then, beginning approximately 50 million years ago, a new group of predators entered the oceans from the land. Early whales evolved from terrestrial mammalian ancestors. These early whales were small and relatively unspecialized, but they represented the beginning of a new evolutionary radiation that would eventually produce the diverse marine mammals we see today. The story of whale evolution parallels the story of marine reptile evolution in many ways. Land-dwelling ancestors returned to the water, initially as semi-aquatic forms hunting in shallow coastal environments. Over millions of years, they became progressively more adapted to fully aquatic life. Their limbs transformed into flippers. Their bodies became streamlined. They lost their body hair and developed blubber for insulation. They evolved various mechanisms for diving, for feeding, for communication in the underwater world. The evolutionary convergence between marine reptiles and marine mammals is striking. Ichthyosaurs and dolphins, separated by over 100 million years of evolution and descended from completely different terrestrial ancestors, evolved remarkably similar body plans. Both are streamlined and torpedo-shaped. Both have dorsal fins. Both have flippers evolved from limbs. Both have tail flukes, though oriented differently, vertical in ichthyosaurs and dolphins, horizontal in fish and sharks. This convergence reveals fundamental truths about adaptation and evolution. The physics of moving through water impose specific constraints and favor specific solutions. Natural selection, working on different lineages in different time periods, produces similar results because the problems being solved are similar. The fact that body plans like the ichthyosaurs have evolved multiple times, in fish, in ichthyosaurs, in dolphins, demonstrates that this design is not arbitrary but represents an optimized solution to the challenges of aquatic life. Yet despite these similarities, marine mammals and marine reptiles differ in important ways. Marine mammals are fully warm-blooded with high metabolic rates, while marine reptiles were likely only partially warm-blooded with intermediate metabolic rates. Marine mammals have evolved sophisticated echolocation systems for hunting in dark or murky water, while there is no evidence that marine reptiles possess such capabilities. Marine mammals include baleen whales that filter feed on tiny organisms, a strategy for which we have limited evidence among marine reptiles. These differences remind us that convergent evolution produces similar but not identical results. Each lineage carries its evolutionary heritage, the constraints and opportunities provided by its ancestry. Marine mammals evolved from terrestrial mammals with particular physiological characteristics, particular genetic toolkits, particular developmental pathways. Marine reptiles evolved from terrestrial reptiles with different characteristics, different toolkits, different pathways. The end results are similar in gross morphology, but differ in details reflecting their different origins. The legacy of marine reptiles extends beyond their evolutionary innovations. The fossils they left behind have profoundly influenced human understanding of evolution, extinction, and deep time. The early discoveries of marine reptile fossils in the early 19th century were among the first clear evidence that Earth had a history vastly different from the present, populated by creatures unlike anything alive today. Mary Anning, an English fossil collector working in the early 1800s, discovered numerous important marine reptile specimens along the Dorset coast, including the first recognized ichthyosaur skeleton and important plesiosaur fossils. Her discoveries challenged contemporary scientific and religious thinking about the history of life and the concept of extinction. The idea that entire groups of organisms could vanish completely from Earth was controversial at the time. It seemed to imply imperfection in divine creation or catastrophic events on a scale difficult to accept. The recognition that marine reptiles represented extinct groups fundamentally different from modern animals helped establish the concept of deep time, the understanding that Earth's history extends back far beyond human experience, measured not in thousands but in millions or billions of years. This concept was revolutionary, transforming our understanding of our place in nature and opening the door to Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. Marine reptile fossils continue to provide crucial data for testing evolutionary hypotheses. The relatively complete fossil record of some groups allows paleontologists to track evolutionary changes over millions of years, observing how body size changed, how specialized features evolved, how geographic distributions expanded or contracted in response to environmental changes. Few groups of organisms have fossil records as rich and as well studied as marine reptiles, making them invaluable for understanding evolutionary processes. The study of marine reptile extinction has similarly influenced our understanding of mass extinctions and their causes. The End Cretaceous extinction event, which eliminated marine reptiles along with non-avian dinosaurs and many other groups, is the best-studied mass extinction in Earth's history. The discovery and confirmation of the impact hypothesis, the idea that an asteroid impact caused the extinction, represents one of the great scientific detective stories of the 20th century. The evidence for the impact accumulated gradually. In 1980, physicist Luis Alvarez and his son, geologist Walter Alvarez, along with their colleagues, published a paper reporting an unusual concentration of iridium in rock layers, marking the end of the Cretaceous period. Iridium is rare in Earth's crust but common in asteroids and meteorites. The global distribution of this iridium layer suggested that a massive asteroid impact had occurred at precisely the time of the extinction. This hypothesis was initially controversial. Many paleontologists argued that the extinction patterns in the fossil record did not support a sudden, catastrophic event, but rather indicated gradual decline over hundreds of thousands of years before the boundary. Others proposed alternative explanations for the iridium. Perhaps it came from volcanic eruptions rather than an impact. Over the following decades, additional evidence accumulated. The discovery of shocked quartz crystals with distinctive microscopic damage patterns created only by extreme pressures like those generated by impacts at the boundary layer provided strong support. The discovery of tektites, glass beads created when rock is melted and ejected by an impact, further supported the hypothesis. And eventually, the discovery of the Chicxulub crater itself, buried under younger sediments but detectable through geophysical surveys, provided conclusive proof that a massive impact had occurred at the right time and place. The impact hypothesis has now been accepted by the vast majority of scientists, though debates continue about details, exactly how quickly the extinction occurred, whether environmental stresses predating the impact had already weakened ecosystems, whether volcanic activity from the Deccan Traps in India contributed to the extinctions. These debates are important for refining our understanding, but do not undermine the basic conclusion that the impact was the primary cause of the mass extinction. The lessons from the end Cretaceous extinction have profound implications for understanding modern environmental change. The extinction demonstrates that even successful, well-adapted organisms are vulnerable to catastrophic environmental disruption. Marine reptiles had dominated ocean ecosystems for over 160 million years, surviving previous environmental changes and mass extinction events. Yet when confronted with the cascading effects of the impact, they vanished completely. This vulnerability is particularly relevant as humans increasingly alter Earth's environment. While we are not causing asteroid impacts, we are disrupting climate, ocean chemistry, and ecosystems in ways that may prove comparably catastrophic for many species. The collapse of marine reptile populations when their food webs disintegrated provides a cautionary example of how disruption to ecosystem foundations can cascade upward to affect even the most dominant species. The study of marine reptiles also illuminates the contingent nature of evolutionary history. If the asteroid had missed Earth, if it had struck a different location, if it had been smaller or larger, the outcome might have been very different. Marine reptiles might still dominate the oceans today, having continued to evolve and diversify for another 66 million years. Alternatively, they might have gone extinct for other reasons at other times. We cannot rerun the experiment to know what might have been. This contingency means that the specific organisms we see today, including ourselves, are products of both lawful evolutionary processes and chance events. Natural selection is predictable in the sense that it favors advantageous traits and eliminates disadvantageous ones. But which traits are advantageous depends on the specific environmental context, which is influenced by unpredictable events like asteroid impacts, volcanic eruptions, and chance colonizations of new habitats. The world we inhabit is shaped by the extinction of marine reptiles and dinosaurs. If those groups had survived, mammals would likely have remained small and relatively unimportant, as they had been throughout most of the Mesozoic. Primates would probably never have evolved. Humans would certainly not exist. Our presence on Earth is, in a sense, a consequence of catastrophic impact 66 million years ago that cleared ecological space for our ancestors to exploit. This realization instills a sense of humility and awe. We are not inevitable. We are not the culmination of a progressive march toward increasing complexity and intelligence. We are one outcome among countless possibilities, shaped by the particular sequence of events that actually occurred. In other possible histories where the asteroid missed or where different survivors radiated after some other mass extinction, entirely different organisms would contemplate their existence and wonder about their origins. The fossils of marine reptiles, preserved in sedimentary rocks worldwide, are monuments to these vanished possibilities. Specimen represents not just an individual organism, but an entire evolutionary lineage. Millions of years of adaptation and diversification, terminated by events beyond any organism's control. The graceful curves of a Plesiosaur's neck, the massive jaws of a Pliosaur, the streamlined body of an Ichthyosaur. These are solutions to the challenges of aquatic life, refined over eons, now frozen in stone. Modern technology continues to reveal new information from these ancient fossils. Synchrotron scanning, using powerful X-ray beams from particle accelerators, can reveal the internal structure of fossils without damaging them, showing details invisible to conventional examination. Chemical analysis using mass spectrometry can detect preserved organic molecules, providing information about diet, metabolism, and evolutionary relationships. Three-dimensional scanning and digital modeling allow researchers to manipulate virtual fossils, testing hypotheses about movement and function that would be impossible with physical specimens. Each technological advance yields new discoveries. Recently, researchers using advanced imaging techniques discovered preserved cellular structures in Mosasaur fossils, revealing details of skin and connective tissue organization. Other studies have identified melanin pigments in Ichthyosaur fossils, suggesting that at least some species had dark coloration similar to modern dolphins and seals. These discoveries transform our understanding of these animals from abstract skeletal reconstructions to more complete pictures of living, breathing creatures. Yet much remains unknown and perhaps unknowable. We will never hear the sounds marine reptiles made, if indeed they vocalized. We will never know the full range of their behaviors, how they courted mates, how they cared for young, how they interacted with members of their own species and with other species. We can infer some behaviors from fossil evidence and comparisons with modern animals, but the private lives of individual Mosasaurs, Plesiosaurs, and Ichthyosaurs are lost to time. This incompleteness of knowledge is frustrating but also inspiring. It means that there are always new questions to ask, new hypotheses to test, new discoveries to be made. Each new fossil locality might yield specimens that challenge existing interpretations or reveal previously unknown species. Each new analytical technique might unlock information preserved in fossils that previous methods could not detect. The study of marine reptiles is not a completed chapter but an ongoing investigation. For those who study these creatures, the fascination extends beyond mere scientific interest. There is something profound about connecting with organisms separated from us by such vast gulfs of time. When a paleontologist carefully excavates a Mosasaur skull from the rock that has encased it for millions of years, they are the first to see this individual since the moment of its death. They are revealing to the world a creature that died in ancient seas that no longer exist, under skies witnessed by no human eyes, in a world unimaginably different from our own. This connection across deep time speaks to fundamental human impulses, our curiosity about the past, our desire to understand our place in the broader context of life's history, our appreciation for the diversity and adaptability of living things. Marine reptiles were not our ancestors. They left no direct descendants, yet they share with us the fact of existence, the challenge of survival, the drive to reproduce and continue their lineages. In understanding them, we understand something about the nature of life itself. The oceans today are very different from the Mesozoic seas that marine reptiles dominated. Modern oceans are cooler, with steeper temperature gradients from tropics to poles. Ocean circulation patterns are driven by this temperature differential, creating the currents that distribute heat and nutrients globally. The chemistry of seawater has changed, influenced by changes in atmospheric composition, weathering patterns, and biological activity. The organisms that populate modern oceans are fundamentally different from those of the Mesozoic, yet in some ways the oceans remain fundamentally similar. They are still driven by photosynthetic production at the base of the food web. They still support multiple levels of predators, from small fish to large sharks and marine mammals. They still face environmental variability and change, though now increasingly driven by human activity rather than natural cycles. The lessons from marine reptile evolution and extinction remain relevant for understanding modern marine ecosystems. As we face contemporary environmental challenges, ocean acidification, warming, overfishing, pollution, the history of marine reptiles provides perspective. Ecosystems that seem stable and permanent can collapse with shocking rapidity when fundamental conditions change. Species that have been successful for millions of years can vanish within generations when environmental change exceeds their capacity to adapt. The interconnectedness of food webs means that disruption at one level affects all levels, often in unpredictable ways. Yet the history also provides hope. After even the most catastrophic mass extinctions, life recovers. It may take millions of years, and the recovery may produce ecosystems fundamentally different from what came before, but life persists and diversifies. The extinction that eliminated marine reptiles also created opportunities for other groups, eventually leading to the diverse marine mammal communities we see today. Destruction and creation are intertwined in the evolutionary process. For humanity, the challenge is to recognize the consequences of our actions while we still have the opportunity to choose a different path. Unlike marine reptiles, we have the capacity to understand environmental change, to predict its consequences, and potentially to mitigate the worst outcomes. We can choose to preserve rather than destroy, to sustain rather than deplete, to protect the intricate web of life rather than unravel it. The fossils of marine reptiles, displayed in museums worldwide, serve as reminders of both the fragility and resilience of life. They remind us that dominance is temporary, that adaptation is essential, that change is the only constant. They remind us to approach the living world with humility, recognizing that we are neither the first nor the last apex predators to imagine our position as permanent and secure. As we conclude this exploration of marine reptile history, we return to the fundamental mystery with which we began. Why didn't dinosaurs conquer the oceans? The answer, as we have seen, is complex. Dinosaurs were supremely adapted to terrestrial life, and that very adaptation created constraints that made the transition to fully marine life difficult or impossible. The evolutionary innovations that allowed them to dominate on land, their hip structure, their respiratory system, their metabolic characteristics, were not easily modified for aquatic life. But evolution works with what is available, not with what would be ideal. Other reptilian lineages, with different starting conditions and different evolutionary trajectories, found pathways into the seas. They evolved different solutions to the same challenges, producing the spectacular diversity of forms we see in the fossil record: Ichthyosaurs with their fish-like bodies, Plesiosaurs with their unique four-flipper propulsion, Pliosaurs with their devastating power, Mosasaurs with their late-arriving but comprehensive success. Each group represents an independent experiment in marine adaptation. Each evolved its own solutions, its own specializations, its own evolutionary trajectory. Together, they populated the Mesozoic seas with a diversity rivaling that of modern oceans, creating ecosystems of stunning complexity and beauty. Their extinction removed them from the world, but not from memory. The rocks preserved their bones, the fossils tell their stories. And we, humans living millions of years later in a world they could never have imagined, piece together those stories, learning from their success and their failure, marveling at their adaptations and mourning their loss. The legacy of marine reptiles extends into our present and future. Every time we consider questions of adaptation, extinction, evolution, or the nature of life itself, the lessons from their history inform our understanding. Every time we face environmental challenges and wonder how ecosystems will respond, the patterns preserved in their fossil record provide guidance. Every time we look at modern marine mammals and wonder at their beauty and sophistication, we can see echoes of convergent evolution that produced similar adaptations in creatures separated by vast stretches of time. The story of marine reptiles is not just ancient history. It is living science, continually refined by new discoveries and new techniques. It is philosophical reflection on the nature of time, change, and existence. It is a reminder of the incredible diversity of life that has existed and the even greater diversity that might yet evolve if we give it the chance. In the dark waters of ancient seas, long before humans existed, marine reptiles ruled supreme. They hunted, bred, competed, and died in cycles repeated for millions of generations. They adapted to changing conditions, evolved to fill new niches, spread across the globe. They experienced success beyond measure by any reasonable standard, more than 160 million years of existence, global distribution, extraordinary diversity. And then they were gone, casualties of a catastrophe they could neither predict nor prevent, leaving behind only their bones buried in stone. But those bones speak to us across the eons, telling stories of life's resilience, creativity, and vulnerability. They remind us that we are part of a story much larger than ourselves, a story that began billions of years before us and will continue long after we are gone. What will our legacy be? What stories will our fossils tell to whatever intelligent species might arise millions of years hence? Will they see evidence of a species that recognized its impact on the world and chose to preserve and protect? Or will they see the marks of destruction, the signatures of mass extinction, the tragedy of intelligence divorced from wisdom? These questions remain unanswered, their resolution dependent on choices we make in the coming decades and centuries. But as we ponder them, the fossils of marine reptiles, those magnificent creatures that ruled ancient seas, stand as silent witnesses to both the grandeur and the fragility of life on Earth.